You guys get some bumper stickers too.
Oh, okay.
Just everything that was involved, from an electronic perspective.
This says that you got to help people.
Okay, that's just a lifeboat type thing, lower to bring people on board and off board. This is deploying DOTs. DOTs are deep ocean transponders. And when we were up north, in order to locate yourself, before you supported, you went into the array just like the submarines do and back, and check your inertial navigator to make sure that it didn't drift off, or whether by correcting it, that the proper corrections are put in. So these are the Bendix. These have been reduced to pencil.
Jimmy Buffett. This came off the Vandenberg.
Transponders now compared to. Well, this is a deep ocean transponder, a Bendix, back in the about 1966 or 7. It was comprised of 3 parts. One was the anchor, which is just going down in the water, the flotation device, and the actual transponder strapped to the side of the flotation.
The power goes out on a ship like that. That's got enough
Even
juice.
at sea.
There's enough juice on that ship to light up a whole city.
Oh yeah, there's 3 2-megawatt generators on that ship. There's a hell of a lot of power.
Yeah, it's not one you want to stick your finger in a socket, right?
No, not one bit. We lost power one time shortly after leaving Portland.
What do you guys do, row?
No, well, no, you drift. But we were just over a sandbar that's off of the mouth of the Columbia River.
Oh, that's the
and
famous
lost power.
one.
Yeah.
That's the one where the...
Everybody goes aground.
That's the one where they have the Coast Guard ships that roll completely over.
That's it.
Do you see any of those coming out against you when you were
but we saw them going over the bar, had gone off maybe 10 miles and lost power.
With the wind blowing you back.
And it was right. Yeah.
These are Arnold, flying Arnold and the Vandenberg. So that's it. That guy's head there is Mel Linton.
Where was this, you said? Where was this? Located at, where was that?
Alameda, New on there. Painted brand new, and it was here for a centennial, for the centennial.
Right.
So that's a classic. And this is an actual U.S. Air Force photo at the Trident Basin, Port Canaveral.
Yeah, do you see that porthole right there? It's right there.
In fact, when he last opened it here,
To decorate it up?
To decorate it up.
That's a lot.
Well, what I'm saying though is it's a lot of ship too.
What are the holes?
The bullet holes are still in it.
From what? From
the
they
movie,
put them in?
From the movie, yeah, they put bullet holes in it.
That's not fair.
They redid the bridge. Oh, you want to know what's not fair? It's all done in Russian. It's all Russian leather.
The Cyrillic stuff.
What?
All the
Yeah, see the bullet holes? They're all still there. So we got pictures of us.
Who plugged them up?
What?
They had to plug.
I don't think it was out for very long, for a long while.
Well, they didn't promote it in this area like I thought they could have with all of the troops that have been around. Now, do you have control of the ship? Does it belong to you, or is it some final? I've got a copy of it. They
Of
were
what the Vandenberg experienced as well.
yes,
I didn't even
absolutely.
bring my Arnold picture.
You know what?
Well, mine are all together.
Hey, you know what? You know what I could say to you, Sam? This is never going to happen to the Vandenberg where it's going. I can guarantee
I'm
that.
going to walk out here and I'll bring over a couple of books.
Great.
You got the one.
Jack, after we finish with this, I can part it with a few pictures.
Let's see the
one at the port.
base of the antenna. All of a sudden, the wires become
Oh yeah. Well, look at this one.
yeah.
New York Harbor at the end of the war. and we interviewed all those guys, and we're working on
Yeah, that's not the. Yeah, that's part of the front part of
a
it.
Soviet
Yeah.
ship
Yeah. And
from the Vandenberg.
From the Vandenberg.
And if you're going to publish anything about these deep ocean transponders, this is the one I want you to publish. Because here's me getting these deep ocean transponders ready for deployment. And there's how cold it was that day with all our foul weather gear on.
What do those transponders do?
Well, what you did, we dropped them into the bottom of the ocean in a triangular array, and then they were surveyed in, and it located precisely the location in the bottom of the ocean. So then the Ares ships, which is the Vandenberg and the Arnold, would come in through this array. They would ping the deep ocean transponders, and then they would set their inertial navigator exactly to that point, so that when you tracked a missile, you would know exactly where you were, and not only that, you would come back after the shot and come through the array and see how much the inertial navigator drifted from the original position, and therefore the people that analyze the data would know exactly where the impact of those Soviet missiles were. Point at it.
Yeah, show me again where you are then.
This is Sam Ninsen right here.
And there's the transponder.
And there's the transponder right there.
Some of the stories before.
There's you.
Guy told this story.
Okay.
Tell that the writing is longer on the Vandenberg. These are Vandenberg.
Show me those again.
Off the Vandenberg, off the tail. And they came down drunk.
There's Mac Monroe, another shipman. He's the guy who works for Nickel Research now that is running the project over there at the NASA area.
No problem.
Yeah, I've been.
Look in there and say hi.
I've already said hello to these gentlemen. Did you find out anything about the old PCB report? To who might have it?
Harvey McDowell.
Harvey.
Yeah, he said he had to do the
I
inventory.
thought maybe you might have it.
And Harvey's already.
Glad you could see me.
Yeah, it's
Good afternoon.
Your name?
I'm Dave. This is my first time here. We're doing a documentary on the Vandenberg.
Oh, the Vandenberg? Arnold and the Vandenberg and all those old ships, yes.
I had the lasso, the two guys.
Spilling out of the Volkswagen bus. 15 grand's a little steep. On the other hand,
But the whole project was became more and more important, I think, to each of us as time went on, and we saw how it was aimed at improving the defense posture of the United States, and that's really what we were doing. We were collecting data on our country's missile systems and other people's missile systems to learn about them, and to then come up with some means of defending against them. So our part of it was really not involved with the launch aspects of missile operations as much as what happened to an object traveling at 15,000 miles an hour as it re-entered the atmosphere at, well, let's say an altitude of 100 miles, where it started encountering air friction and heating and wild motions and whatever. And that served as, I think, the key. People studied that, saw what happened, made changes to their missile systems, and from that were able to develop better methods of doing things. So that's where, in a nutshell, is what we did.
Now, so you think, looking at some of the Soviet data, now obviously our engineers, missile engineers, were able to look at it and to see not only what the guy next door was doing, but to also see if there were things we could improve or to be looking out for.
Let me tell you a funny story that doesn't deal with the missiles as much. There was a question raised as to how to tell the difference between a Russian and an American helicopter. You can't ever guess what it was. The data from the radar showed the propellers on the blades on the helicopters traveled in opposite directions. One goes clockwise and the other goes counterclockwise. Simple, but it takes some rather refined radar data and analysis to find that sort of thing. And basically that's what our ship systems did. They measured some of the unique characteristics. Took a lot of people with a lot of brains to go back and do statistical analysis and look at the stuff and say, oh my God, I never saw that before. And that's where so much was learned. Some by accident, maybe a lot by accident. A lot by people recognizing differences. What did that? And that was a key to, I think, the success that we had. And obviously the operation and looking at this particular ship as the Vandenberg by itself is just one small aspect. But if you consider that today there are more advanced radars on other ships, on another ship specifically, that are doing the same thing but to a larger degree, is intriguing to me. And I'm just pleased to see the program go on.
What would you say, I mean, with your life, the shipping so much a part of you, did you realize when this was going through what was happening, that history was kind of being made with the space program?
No, absolutely, I could say no. We didn't realize it. It was as things started to accumulate. And another story along those lines. We were asked to prepare a briefing for the Joint Chief of Staffs at the Pentagon. And we sat down, a group of us around a table at the office, and said, okay, what are some of the firsts? What are some of the accomplishments that we think we've done or made? Made up a list. And one of the guys sat there and said, my God, when you put these things all together on one package, it's classified beyond a level that any of us are allowed to see. At certain levels, things become classified secret or top secret. But all together as a package, we had to lock it up in a safe and get somebody from the security department to come down and say, what do we do with this? And it truly was beyond a level that any of us were supposed to know as in a composite type of world. And it was significant. The items that were found individually were trivial. Together, it was remarkable. And many of the people, the crew, you take a marine crew that's operating a ship and a technical crew that's operating the electronics, and they don't know and didn't know. And it took powers and experience beyond even my level, where people were sitting down and looking at the data. The final product was hard copy stuff on magnetic tape and on printed paper and photographs and whatever, to sit down and analyze it and figure, what did that? Why did that occur? What can we do to counter it? And that's led to a significant bit of the development of, well, let's say the Star Wars program, which is now a term out of favor, but that's what's going into things like the radars that were used to detect the missiles launched into Israel and whatever. So it still goes on. And it's amazing. We kind of made a joke out of it that one of our radars was good at detecting objects, and the other one was such that we could almost tell whether a screw in the side of the missile was a Phillips head screw or a straight slotted screw. bit of an exaggeration, but the degree of detail that you can collect from information, radar information, is phenomenal.
What does the Vandenberg mean to you? I mean, when you think of everything that's involved, and obviously, in talking about it, you're very passionate about it. What is it? How can you sum that up?
It was a career that was frustrating, tremendously interesting, where we could not immediately see the end results, but as data was collected, then we could see it. And I was in a different position. I was sitting back on shore most of the time. People that were operating the equipment were at sea, and I spent some time at sea also. We had a bit of insight greater than what the ship's people did. So they didn't know the degree of accomplishment that was going on, and we did.
What specific? Oh, I'm sorry. What specifically was your job on land?
Mine started off with working with navigation systems, with inertial nav systems, star trackers, Loran-C, and that was back in the mid-60s. And as technical achievements were made and we went into the global positioning, the GPS systems, and other types of navigation systems, we took advantage of them. We used to say that we used to be able to locate our ship to within 1,500 feet any place in the world. And one guy kind of made a joke out of it one time. The captain on the bridge called up and he said, can you tell me what your instruments say where we are? And the guy responded and said, Captain, do you want to know where the bow or the stern is? Now that's 500 and some feet difference. And it wasn't a joke. We could have told him where it was. The refinement and the degree of accuracy was great to where we could get down. 100 feet was routine. We could do better than that on occasions. That progressed, and then I started going into working with data and computer systems, and my primary background, even before I became involved, was radar and communications. So I was kind of one of these project guys that was a jack of all trades and knew a little bit about a lot of things. I was not a design engineer. I was one of those guys that was supposed to know how the black boxes fit together and what they were supposed to do. Not necessarily what went on within a black box, although I'd spent a number of years working in design engineering too, so that was just part of my career. And,
just like the history was being kind of written as you went along, what about the technology? I mean, it must have eclipsed itself a couple times in where the system, when you took delivery in 1964 to the end, what was that like?
Well, we started off working with equipment that was new as far as transistorized systems were involved. A significant number used vacuum tubes, which most young engineers today wouldn't even recognize if they saw one. I asked one guy one time to tell me what was the voltage that was supposed to be on the screen grid of a tube. And he says, which is the screen grid? And I knew I was in trouble immediately at that point. But then we saw that evolve, and the vacuum tubes went away and transistors came into being. Equipment got smaller, mainly more reliable to a large degree. That was a significant thing. And then we saw semiconductors and integrated circuits come in, and what we had is equipment that would fill 5 or 6 electronic racks of equipment would go down, and it would be a shoebox size. Bit of an exaggeration there, but that's and that made a huge difference. And operating in a marine environment where vibration is the rule, and pretty tough on electronic systems where modules are plugged into sockets and they can vibrate, the change towards miniaturization did marvels as far as we were concerned, and we could see the technology change from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits to PCs. The computers that we started off with would be the size of a closet for a small computer. And then we had the main system was a CDC computer of a scientific size that would fill the downstairs of any 3-bedroom home. And now that's shrunk to a lot smaller in size. So we've seen that as an evolution and different problems. That evolution did not come cheaply. We had people that were skilled with one aspect of maintenance and they had to change, and they did. Some people could not adapt. You know, it was tough when you had a technician that wanted to use a large, heavy soldering iron to work on an integrated circuit. Didn't work, and we had to get specialized training for soldering techniques for general maintenance. And it would evolve down to where somebody in the early stages would have to find which was the defective component. And then it changed to where you found which was the defective module. And it then got to which was the bad chassis. And you started replacing where somebody, their whole technique of repair had to change. And that was a big problem. You know, it went along with another problem. People in the early days were more skilled at finding a defective component. But with the evolution of the changes for the design techniques and whatever, you lost that degree of skill, and people became black box experts. I can find this chassis and I'll send that back to somebody to repair. I can't go inside it. I don't know enough about it. And that was a revolting development, as well as being a revolutionary one.
Now, I talked to some of the guys about, you know, the data that you collected, or the ship collected, and the orders if the ship's security were to be compromised, what they were supposed to do with some of that data. What do you know about that? Is it?
If you're looking at the recent incident involving the aircraft landing in Hainan, on the island of Hainan, we had similar type situations. Our data was to be protected. We carried what was called a capacitive discharge destruct unit, where the magnetic tapes were stored in file cabinets, like a drawer in a file cabinet in an office, except they were set up with batteries and a magnetic system device that if two people took their keys, literally like a car key, and plugged it in and pressed the destroy button, it would go through and magnetically erase everything on those tapes. And that could be as many as 500 tapes of the old 10.5-inch size, half-inch wide computer tape. A lot of data. That would take about 10 minutes to go through and thoroughly destroy them so they couldn't be recovered. We carried axes in many places to wreck equipment. Other places we had a heavy canvas bag of a post office type that were weighted with lead and perforated or had the holes punched in them so that you could take stuff and get it out on the deck and throw it overboard. We had paper shredders. You have paper shredders at most homes now to cut up stuff in strips a 1/4 inch wide and across the width of a paper. Our shredders were set up that the smallest particle would be a 32nd of an inch in diameter or smaller. They ran with 25 horsepower motors to grind them up, and they were tremendously noisy. And you could feed in stacks of printed computer paper, and out the other end would come mush. It was impossible to put them together and to make any sense out of it. Periodically, like once a year, we'd take a magnetic tape, put it into a system, and try to erase it, send it back to Washington to see if they could recover any of the data off of it. If they did, we were in trouble. If they didn't, then we got an A+ and we passed. There were destruct measurement or destruct exercises held periodically, unannounced, sometime in the afternoon or sometime during the day. The alarm would go off to man your stations and destroy up to category so-and-so, which basically would mean get everything ready to destroy, but don't push the start button yet. And it would be timed, just like a fire drill would be at some office building. And we trained at that, so that in the event of a boarding, we could react. And from what I know of the Navy's incident, they did about the same. They had stuff ready to go, and they probably destroyed a lot of it. But we were operating along similar principles 30 years ago.
There was something about a some kind of thing that would melt.
Right.
What was that thing?
There were, again, safe type of drawers that were equipped with high temperature incendiary devices that would heat up in 15 seconds to melt things, and literally the temperatures would get to 3,000 degrees in seconds. Very touchy. There were specific procedures and equipment to cause them to ignite. There were exhaust systems on them that would take to a chimney outside the ship that were thermally insulated in space so that that heat would not be transferred to anything that should cause a fire within the ship. They were exercised. If there were things to destroy, they would be put in those devices, the system keyed and made ready for destruction. Once you started it, there was no chance to stop it. You'd best follow the directions because it amounted to a mini explosion when it started. If the drawer was not securely locked in place, it would probably be blown out, and the individual, if he was standing in front of it, would lose his legs. Never happened. We never had to light them, but they were checked every 6 months or a year to make sure that they were still in full operational condition. And that was a routine exercise. You know, we were not necessarily subject to being boarded, but it was a possibility.
What was your closest encounter with that?
Well, we had aircraft operations that were probably less severe than the ones from the recent China problem. We used to talk about being badgered, and typically the Russians would have aircraft go by us up one side of the ship and down the other. And we knew they were equipped with electronic surveillance gear and photographs, and they'd videotape or photograph everything that they could see on board. We knew they were monitoring our radio communications transmissions, and they would fly around us for a while, not in an unsafe manner. You know, they were maybe 100 yards off the ship, but when you've got a 4-engine jet bomber flying by you that close and at that speed, it got your attention. Then we had a number of times where ships would come by us and cruise off of our sides relatively closely, not enough to cause an impediment to driving the ship, if you will. But they were there. They kept on our sides and monitored what we were doing. At one time, and this was kind of a funny incident, they had transfer of materials, let's say, back and forth. We fixed up I wasn't on board at the time, so I'm telling this is secondhand. They fixed up a floating package and sent it over to one of the other ships that contained a lot of fresh fruit. They sent back stuff in return. The second transfer was Playboy magazines. They came back with something else, and it was like, yeah, fellas, you know, we're all brothers under the same skin. We're going under different philosophical ideas, but we're here doing the same thing, so we don't bother you, you don't bother us. But we're keeping track of you just in case.
That's good. That's good. Well, gosh, what am I forgetting? What's something that really sticks out that I'm not asking you about?
Oh, I think one of the things is time in port. When a ship was out for 60 or 90 days and came back, most people had an awful thirst. So don't stand in the way of the gangway when they're getting ready to get off. And I made that mistake at ADAC one time and almost ended up in the bay. I put foot on the gangway as soon as the ship was ready to board, and there were a dozen people coming down. And I got out of the way because they were headed over to have a few beers. And we tried for a long time to see if the Navy would relent and allow beer or something to be served in glasses and under a kind of you can have 2 glasses of beer a day or something like that. And we're never able to do that, even though we went back and quoted all the old British regulations about everybody having their pint or their brandy or something. And that was one thing. People got off the ship, and after being confined, the first thing they would head to would be to get something to drink other than a Coke, then to try a different restaurant, even if it was going to be a military kitchen, whatever, just to get something different, to walk on land. It was a tremendous sense of difference after spending 6-7 weeks at sea and then get off and start walking around. And I thought this old bit of sea legs and land legs was just so much poppycock until it happened to me the first time. There is a difference. You get on the sea, on the ship, and you have to become accustomed to the ship rolling. You get on land after being at sea, and now you have to be reaccustomed in a different manner because you're kind of walking around waving, kind of wobbling down the sidewalk, and everything else is standing still. It took a while to acclimate to having land legs as contrasted to sea legs. I think one of the things that I remember most was going out to one of the guys that was here today on my first real at-sea exercise. I started to turn green afterwards, and stomach wasn't feeling too good. So he says, "Come on with me." And he had been a Navy lieutenant. He said, we went down to the mess hall, and he got to one of the cooks and said, "You got a bowl of soup?" He says, "Yeah." "Okay. Take that." And he dragged out. He said, "Now give us a handful of crackers." "Okay, Pat, sit down. Eat the soup and eat as many of the crackers as you can." He says, "All right." Went back up to my stateroom, laid down, and half an hour later, nothing, no problems whatsoever. And I guess getting all that bulk and everything into the stomach created a different situation. And I did well. And after that was my one and only time that I ever felt like I was getting seasick. After that one incident, it never reoccurred, even though I was going back on the ship.
Did you do any of the missions in the Bering Sea?
Yes, sir.
Because that's one area I guess some of the guys have touched on it, but haven't really got a good feel for what that was like as far as temperature conditions and fear.
Well, I was there in October, November. We'd sailed out of Adak, Alaska, and they refer to that place as where the winds of the world begin, and that's true. I've never been in any place that howled so much in my life. And left there under sea conditions that were less than great, and everything was kind of wobbling around, and sailed off. And a couple hundred miles later, we woke up in the morning and we could see the peaks on the mountains of Kamchatka. The weather was generally, I was going to say good, but it really wasn't. There were times where you could go out and walk around on the deck during the daytime, but you wouldn't want to do it at night. The ship was totally dark on the deck. There were no lights, obviously, so that the bridge watch could see if there were any other ships in the vicinity. And you wouldn't want to go out ever alone. You could stumble and fall over, and in that cold water, you'd never survive. Some of the days were gorgeous, where you'd see clear blue sky and the mountains on the horizon. And then again, there were times where the ship was rolling 25 degrees in each direction, and you had to hold on with every ounce of strength that you had. You walked down a passageway, you had your hands on the handrails to counter any of the ship's motion. A lot of ice and snow at times. Typically, the winds could be 30 knots, which is pretty decent at sea. Not too bad if you're going with the wind, but then when you turn around and if you're going another 15 knots into the wind, you've got 45-mile-an-hour gusts across the deck, and that's pretty hard to stand up under. There were days where we never saw the outside, and that becomes hard to take. And I've often wondered, how do the people on the Polaris submarines react when they can't see, they don't know what's going on outside. And one time we took a TV camera and set it up on the bridge to look over the bow at the waves. That was discontinued because people were getting seasick from watching the TV motion. So,
well, what do you think ARC? And we plan to, the final port of call is Key West for the Vandenberg.
I think it's one of the best things that I've heard. I was involved with the deactivation of the sister ship for the Vandenberg, the USNS Arnold. And it sat in a port for a while. was towed off to Honolulu and then to Taiwan to be cut up and melted down for other stuff. And that's kind of an inglorious end of a valiant ship. So when I heard of the ARC program and what was destined for the Vandenberg, my first reaction was, oh gee, isn't there something better? And then I went back and said, no, the life of the ship will continue in the minds of many people for a long, long time. She was built around 1944. We're now 2001. Who knows, 100 years from now, there may be still some of the remnants laying on the ocean that says, USNS Hoyt-S Vandenberg. And I think that's a far better fate than I could imagine. I don't know, the alternate, to melt it down, is nothing. This is one that I thoroughly support and agree with. I think whoever came up with the idea to pick that ship was a great idea, from my viewpoint. And I'm biased, more than just a little bit, as being involved with her for so long. It was an integral part of my life.
I think we got it. I like your idea of the round table. I think...
Would you mind if I applied for a job on a ship? And I said, yeah, I would. It can be a roughneck crew at times. As in any part of the world, you can find good guys and bad guys. And I said, I'm not sure it's a good environment for somebody of your age. I said, tell me why you want to go. And his comment was, well, I'd like to earn enough money so that I could afford to go to the college of my choice rather than one that we as a family can afford. That kind of knocked the pins out from under me. You know, the logic was almost irrefutable. Well, you know, not a bad idea. But there's one proviso. You sign on for an 18-month tour, and at the end of 18 months, you promise me you're getting off and going back to school. The pay was pretty good. There were no real living expenses. Everything was provided except when it came into port. You would have to rent a car or something. And, all right, now we have to sell your mother. Mom was not thrilled with the idea at all. And he talked about it for a long time and said, well, all right. So he signed on, and we were out at Port Canaveral when the ship left. And we could see Paul as he'd go from one deck to the upper deck to the next deck in the stern of the ship, and the ship is getting smaller and it's disappearing towards the horizon, and eventually it's out of sight where he can't see anybody. And this is the first time that boy has ever been going away from home so that he will not be back for 6 months. That's kind of a tough way for a kid to break into a relatively lonely life. But there was one guy on board, very strong in my memory, named Dan Vida, who I knew and trusted implicitly. So I went to him before Paul went on board and I said, Dan, would you do me a favor? Would you be a godfather to my son at sea? I would like him to be able to come to you if he needed help. I would like you to be able to go to him and say, Paul, knock it off. You wouldn't normally get in this kind of a situation at home. Well, the guy was, Dan was absolutely floored. And at first he didn't know what to say. All of a sudden it struck him. He said, I'd be proud to do that. So we discussed that with Paul and said, okay, Paul, you know Dan. I know Dan. Dan will not give anything out of confidence to me, but he will be looking over your shoulder and he's there for your help and support. And he did. And that made a difference in the degree of comfort that we as a family had. And was down at Antigua one time when the ship came in, and he didn't expect me. So I was standing on the dock when the ship pulled up, and he came up, looked over, and he was floored at the fact that I was there. And it was, as you might guess, a very friendly greeting.
Yeah.
We went off to the base club that evening, and he had a couple of screwdrivers sitting in front of him. of the liquid variety.
Right.
And I looked down at him and I said, "Hey, be careful." And the ship's manager was standing near me and he says, "Knock it off. We take care of each other." He says, "He won't get into trouble." I said, "Right. Thank you, God."
That's good.
So, yeah, a lot of that stuff. One of our best friends died here a couple of weeks ago, and I wished he would have been alive and been in a condition to talk to you about some of this stuff, but even a
A lot
year
of people
ago.
talked about him.
And he was godfather to an entire crew. And if you got 50, 60, 70 people under you, you know that when you come into port, some of them are going to get into trouble of one sort or another. And he had to take care and shepherd all of them. And that was true for all of the ship's managers. And I sit back and think of some of the stories that they had to tell and that I can only remember parts of. You know, having a bunch of guys to babysit is a problem. And how do you take care of it? The difference in personalities and whatever. We could sit and talk a lot about, you know, developments of the electronics, developments of techniques. You know, how do you find a target that is, let's say, suppose you were to take a cone that was like 4 feet long, 3 or 4 feet in diameter across the base, that's coming towards you, kind of, at some angle, and it's 700 or 1,000 miles away. And you consider looking in the sky for something like that, and you're on a rolling and pitching ship at sea at a location that might not be quite as well known as you'd like, and you're looking off at the sky at something and say, where is it? And you develop all kinds of techniques, aim a radar beam. And we're talking about a radar beam similar, if you want to compare it as a simile, to the beam from a flashlight, a very narrow beam flashlight, very concentrated. And you're shining that beam around through the room or something, trying to find a nail. Only take that and say, okay, this beam is 4/10 of a degree wide. Pretty narrow.
Is that what the dishes? Where did the beam transmit from? Did it go from the dishes, or?
It was basically the transmitter energy was fed out through what we call waveguide, which is just a rectangular duct, like an air conditioning duct.
We've got some of that in TV. That's how we have a satellite truck.
Yep.
So
Yeah, you're using small stuff, but some of ours was many times. One of the radar waveguides,
like that big. You know?
Right, and one of ours was 22 inches across, 22 by roughly 14 inches. Be a good air conditioning duct. Mm-hmm. That was for the lower frequency radars. The higher ones would waveguide get smaller and smaller to where the stuff is towards what you're using. It would go to what essentially was called a horn, and basically it would be a rectangular device similar to the horn that you'd find on a trumpet, except rectangular. That would radiate energy towards the reflector, the dish, and that would aim it. That was a parabolic structure, and it would focus it just as the reflector on a radar, on a flashlight would do.
Oh, sure. Actually, very similar in how we transmit our microwave.
Absolutely identical. You know, the techniques of radar transmission haven't changed. The physics of it are the.
I just wonder, as I look at that ship, what's transmitting, what's receiving. You know. So
well, there was common. If you took and looked at a block diagram of the radar, there was what was called a TR, a transmit receive device. So as you hit it with a large burst of RF energy in a transmit, this little TR device would prevent that energy from going through and wrecking the receiver. A pulse would be emitted from the horn into the reflector, out into space, hit it there, bounce back, and now come back into the antenna again through that same device, but now it would come into the TR and it would send it off a different channel into the receiver. And then
so
that
if
was
pulses were off, you'd fry your receiver. Probably over.
Yeah, but that's kind of a simplification of it. Ideally, you would like to send one pulse out, wait until it got there, came back, went into your receiver.
Kind of like sonar. Well, tell me about your experience on the Vandy. When you have to explain the Vandy or your time, how do you explain it to somebody when you first meet somebody?
The Vandenberg was a reentry ship. I got into what's called reentry physics and reentry phenomenology and signature analysis and things like that in 1961 at the University of Michigan. About 1966 at the university, we got a report in one day from a ship, and it had this Russian missile coming in, impacting on the Kamchatka Peninsula and this X in the ocean where the ship was. I said, wow. And within a year I was working for them, and it was not planned. I was ready to leave the university, and I just chopped my resume around and ended up down here because it was a place where you could look at more than one reentry system, and I was interested in a broader view of things. I was hired in and worked in what's called ships operations, which was headquartered here at Patrick Air Force Base. I worked in operations planning. I was more of a generalist than a lot of people. A lot of people were specific to radar or to optics or to telemetry, and a lot of the people on board the ship were technicians that were very hardware oriented. And I had a little bit bigger worldview. I understood missile systems in general and reentry systems in particular, and wasn't fussy about whose. And I became, in the course of my time with RCA, kind of a discrimination algorithm. I was the guy who understood the missile systems, so when a ship was going to Kamchatka, I would go out, ride the ship, and I was the one who sat in front of the radar console and watched all the little squiggly lines and said, track that piece there, not this piece over here, because I had a feel for how the missiles worked and what was likely to be the RV, the warhead. And so I was a permanent crew here at Patrick Air Force Base and TDY on the ship, but it was TDY for like 2 months at a time, once, maybe twice a year in those days, both the Arnold and the Vandenberg.
Talk to me, you said a little bit, you guys were Cold Warriors and didn't quite know it at the time.
Well, I don't think none of us thought of ourselves as Cold Warriors. And if you'd asked me in 1967 what my job was, I'd have said I was a reentry physicist. If you'd asked me in 72, I'd probably said the same thing. And I left RCA in 79 to go to a small business up in Huntsville, which was in the ballistic missile defense business. At that point, I became kind of a threat analyst. If you're going to build a ballistic missile defense system, you have to know what it is you're defending against, which is the other guy's missiles. And between the experience I had from the ships and some other background that I had and the understanding of reentry physics and things, I ended up in the business of analyzing intelligence data on the other guy's systems. And I would have changed to threat analyst. But none of us ever said we're Cold Warriors. We're just people doing a job. It was an interesting job. It was a fun job. It had its moments. And it was a job that quite obviously needed to be done. I think everybody was fairly patriotic. We knew we needed to do this. Somebody needed to do it. It may as well be us.
What would be like your most memorable moment from the ship, or maybe describe what?
There are a lot of them. Probably my first trip would be the most memorable one, and it'll take 10 minutes to describe. I went to work for RCA in the spring of '67, and one of the first things they did was send me out for an orientation cruise. And the plan was I would get on the ship in Long Beach, California. It was the Arnold, not the Vandenberg, but I would get on the ship in Long Beach, California. We were going to stop in Pearl Harbor for a couple of days, and then we were going to go down to Kwajalein, and we were going to support a missile launch from Vandenberg, and I would get off at Kwaj and come home. I'd be about between 2 and 3 weeks on the ship. We left Long Beach, and after we went to sea, the chief engineer did an inspection, and government ship, you're not supposed to have alcohol on board, and he found booze in some of his troops' lockers and threw all the booze over the side. And mysteriously, the guy that had the most booze was the third engineer, and very mysteriously, on his watch, next watch after the chief engineer did that, we got salt water in the boilers and came to a screeching halt in the middle of the ocean. We were dead in the water for 2 days, and then we got a little bit of steam back, and it took us another 10 days or so to limp into Pearl Harbor. When we got to Pearl Harbor, I called my boss, and he said, well, they say it's only going to be a week, so just stay with the ship and go ahead to Kwajalein with it. And 1 week at a time, they dragged that 1 week out to 5 weeks. Okay, so I got 5 weeks in Pearl Harbor. I've never needed a road map in Hawaii since. Okay, and And when we left, we didn't go to Kwajalein, okay? Because while we were there, the Russian ships deployed for a broad ocean long-range launch out beyond Midway at a place called Milwaukee Seamount. So we went to Milwaukee Seamount. And it was the first tests of what was called the SS-13, a solid motor ICBM that was the equivalent of our Minuteman I, the first long-range test. There were 2 of them. We finished that up, and they sent us to Yokohama in Japan. And as we were en route to Yokohama, the light bulb changer, the least electrician, who'd been brooding the whole time, shot the captain. And I was standing on deck with my roommate, a fellow named Frank Nelson, a radar engineer, and we were eating ice cream out of a paper cup, leaning on the railing, watching the sunset, and the PA came on as the first engineer, and I can still remember the announcement. He says, "Attention all on board. Attention all on board. There's a crewman loose on deck with a gun. He has already shot at least 1 person. That is all." And we looked at each other and just dropped the ice cream in the ocean and headed for the cabin. And you could hear doors slamming and portholes bolting and things like that all over the ship. But what he did was he had a grievance. He'd asked for a bigger advance before the crew started than the captain could give him. The captain gave him the maximum, and the guy at sea sort of transferred all his problems with his wife and his daughter and his life in general to the captain. That was all the captain's fault. So he took a pistol, which he wasn't supposed to have, out of a sea bag and hid in the captain's shower. And when the captain came back from chow, he stepped out of the shower and shot him.
Did you kill him?
No. He fired, we think, 3 shots at the captain. The captain had 2 holes in him, 1 through his chest and 1 through his arm. May have been the same bullet, may have been 2 different bullets. But he ran out into the companionway, and it's 1 flight up to the bridge deck, and the mate was up there, looked down, and the guy fired a couple of shots up the companionway, and they kind of ricocheted off the bulkheads, and he ran out on deck. And what he did was he threw the gun over the side and hid in the lifeboat, but nobody knows that. But they got a search party together with billy clubs and things, and they went looking for him, and they found him, and they locked him up. And so now we're in a situation where we're 600 miles from Japan and steaming towards Japan. We've got a captain who's bleeding internally. We have a medic on board. The medic says he's stable, but he has internal bleeding. We need whole blood, O negative, I think it was, and we could stand another medic or 2. So they sent an airplane out, a C-130, out from Japan with paramedics and a doctor. That's when I discovered that doctors don't parachute jump, medics do. Okay. And they arrived in the middle of the night, and the situation was that we had first mate in charge of the vessel, comatose captain, a third mate who had to handle a small boat. We had to put a small boat over the side to recover these, and the ship's operations manager, who I think was probably Jim Edwards, who's in there right now. Jim Edwards said, "Mac," he said, "you got a pilot's license, right?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You used to skydive, right?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You've worked as a merchant seaman?" I said, "Yeah," which I did on the Great Lakes when I was going to college. And he said, "Maybe you can help." Okay. So I went up to the bridge and I sat there with 2 walkie-talkies, 1 to explain the airplane to the ship, and 1 to explain what the airplane wanted to the small boat that was alongside. And we laid out a bunch of flares and floating flares in the water in the middle of the night in fair seas, and put a small boat over the side. These guys parachuted. We picked into this lane that we laid with the flares, picked them up in the small boat, managed to get the small boat back on. All this was exciting because it's a kind of a bumbling crew, and the seas were just choppy enough to make things challenging. We got them all on board. The other 2 medics checked the captain over, figured out exactly the same thing that the medic we had, but they brought whole blood with them, and now we got 3 so they can keep a watch on him all the time. And when we got all done, I'm standing here with these 2 things, and while we're waiting for the medics to check things out, we got every light on the ship on in the middle of the night. Everything is lit up, and the airplane radioed down and said, "What in the world kind of ship are you anyway?" And we just said, "Never mind, it's not your problem." And 3 days later, we stopped at Yokosuka, put the captain ashore on a tug to the Yokosuka hospital, 1 up to Yokohama and tied up. And 3 or 4 days later, I flew back to Florida. That was my introductory cruise.
That's a good one.
And it just got more and more amazing after that. So.
this ship had some of the the leading edge technology on board because you guys were kind of inventing as you guys were going along. Talk about that.
Well, it was a mixture of always of the old and the new, of things that worked and things that didn't. I was hired. I'd been analyzing mostly optical data, though a little bit of radar and stuff like that at the University of Michigan. And when I came down there, the original intent was to improve the optics, but money was going away, and optics were third position anyway behind radar and telemetry, so that I had to learn radar and telemetry. And we had not the best radars in the world. The radars on Roy Namur, built by Lincoln Labs, were better, but they don't go anywhere. They stay on Roy Namur forever. And we were the best mobile system in the world at the time, as far as signature radar, as far as telemetry capability goes. And of course, we had an extra telemetry room, which was the SIGINT room. And say you've been paying attention to the P3 crew and things like that. Well, it was a bunch of guys like that that ran that. And that was one of our auxiliary things was SIGINT, and telemetry was telemetry on foreign missiles as well as domestic. We were ace tracking company,
Tell me how it worked. I understand when some of these, when the Soviet missiles would come in, we had a better idea what was coming at us than the Russians did as far as where it was going. I understand that our tracking was better. Talk about how you.
Oh, I'm not sure we ever knew what was coming better than the Russians did. They was their systems, and they knew. As far as being able to track it, maybe our data was a little better than theirs, but they didn't need the signature data that we needed because they had the telemetry data and things like that, which we didn't always get. Sometimes there were capsules that were parachuted and recovered on the Kamchatka Peninsula and things like that, so there was information that was not broadcast that we couldn't get, and then some of the information that was broadcast was encrypted, and who knows what, one day you can break somebody's encryption, and the next day you can't. So
talk about that at a moment's notice, that data had to be able to be secured or destroyed if the ship were to be compromised. Talk about how you guys had to keep your finger on the trigger of that.
Oh, yeah, that you can overdo that. I was fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to be involved in the first cruise off Kamchatka in 1969 on the Vandy, after the Pueblo was captured. And we had a 3-day pre-sale conference in the PACAF headquarters at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. And there were, I think, 21 flag officers in the room, admirals and generals, one kind or another, all fussing about could we destroy things in time, and would we find ourselves in the same position as the Pueblo? And we had a lot of the same equipment that the Pueblo had, or lack of equipment that the Pueblo had, and we literally generated a ton of data with every mission. We made paper tabs and magnetic tapes and things like that these days you could fit on a couple of CD-ROMs or DVD-ROMs and be done. But literally, it was over 2,000 pounds of data per mission. I've been on that mission on that ship when we had 12 to 15 missions on board. Okay, I mean, you fill a flatbed truck 15 feet high with data boxes and ADAC to be hauled over, registered mail to be hauled over and shipped out of the ADAC post office. And there's no way in the world you can destroy that quickly. Okay, but there was really very little risk off the Soviet coast. It was entirely different than the situation off the Korean coast. And we really weren't tremendously worried about it. We had some specialized destruction equipment for the crypto gear, and they would never gotten any crypto gear. It was trays that were made out of thermite, and you just pull the computer cards or PC cards out of the crypto gear, drop them in the trays, shoved them in a big vault, pull the lever, and the thermite fired, and it became 5,000 degrees inside that vault in about 30 seconds. So, but as far as the data was concerned, we never were. I don't think we were ever panicked about it if the Russians did get it all. It was their missile. I mean, what are we going to tell them that they don't already know? So.
Well, then my last question. Talk about the Vandenberg has obviously got a new mission. It's going to its final port of call is Key West. So what's your thoughts on what we're going to do with the ship?
I think it's a wonderful thing. It's a far more noble end to that ship than the Arnold got. I've got a photograph somewhere that I'll get to you guys one of these days. The Arnold and another Liberty ship were under tow, a 2-vessel tow to Taiwan to be broken up. And they got caught in Hurricane Iniki, I think it was, near Hawaii, broke tow and were drifting for several days. And they were recovered, and the Arnold was anchored off the fishing harbor in Kealo Basin in Honolulu. And one of the Honolulu Observer photographers went down there and took a picture of her sitting there, and she's down by the bow and listing, and one of the antennas is missing, and it really looks sad, you know. And they pumped her out and got her stable again, and then just dragged her on out the rest of the way to Taiwan to be broken up. A reef is a much more noble way to end up for a ship. I mean, the Vandy had a long and productive life, as the Taylor and as the Vandy. And as a matter of fact, where I'm working now, I have some pieces of the Vandy. When they deactivated her in '93, we went up there and took some bits and pieces that we could use, including some telescopes and things like that. So, no, I think it's a fine thing to do. I'm looking forward to watching her go down, and I'll be there cheering with everybody else.
Yes.
Jack James, and let's see. I think I didn't get aboard the Vandy until must have been sometime in '65.
What was going on then in the world right there? It looks like we were in the middle of a space program and also the missiles.
Well, that was back in the days when we were developing the signature system for the missiles, and the course tied between the two ships, you know, the Arnold and the Vandenberg, and we were doing the original development. And of course, like today, it's automatic. The computer takes all the information and crunches it through, and you come out in 15 minutes, you come out with the answers. But back in the days of developing, we had to take all the numbers that came out of the computer and crunch them by hand, and we couldn't even figure out what happened to tracking a balloon, for cripe's sakes, for 3 hours to find out, to get 1 point in the balloon. And,
how would you describe the ship? If you had to tell somebody you hadn't met before on the street, you had to talk to them about the Vandy. Let me get this. How would you describe the Vandy to somebody that you never met before?
the Great White Fleet. It's a big ship. Of course, it wasn't the biggest I was ever on, because I spent 20 years in the Navy. And but I had a lot of good experiences on the Vandy. Most of my time on the Vandy was spent TAD. Came back at Patrick and was working on the data end of it. And then I'd have to go out to the Vandy every once in a while to work on some of the equipment.
What is TAD? Is that tracking and?
Temporary additional duty.
Oh, okay.
And then when we separated the two ships, the Arnold was out in the Pacific and the Vandy was over in the Atlantic. I spent a little bit of time on it then. We brought it out of wet storage. Had it in wet storage here in Port Canaveral for, I guess it was about a year or a year and a half. And of course we had a crew that run it through its paces to keep it ready to go. And, it had big cables. We didn't have the engine room running because sitting in Port Canaveral, no way to get water. And so we had big cables running over with our power and through the side of the ship down to the engine room to the panel. To the electrical
power, huh?
Yeah. And then we brought it out of wet storage and we took it down to South Atlantic, and we did most of the tracking
Eyewitness News this day.
Let's see, where was I? Oh yeah, we brought it out of wet storage, took it off and did our testing, ready to go, and then we did quite a bit of tracking with the British and their missiles, re-entry. And I was aboard most of the time with the working with the British, and I got to know quite a few of the people there. But all in all, I was assigned back to Patrick as the data, would take the data off of the ships and crunch it back here for the final output. But all in all, I never really spent that much time on the Vandy.
What's one of your favorite stories, or maybe your favorite, most memorable moment on the ship?
Oh, I guess coming out of Seattle, not Seattle, coming out of Portland, and just as we crossed the bar there, we lost power. And it was about 4 hours before they got enough power to get us up going again. And of course, here we are drifting towards the reef there quite a bit. In fact, they'd even call up the Coast Guard and warn the Coast Guard that we were adrift. That was about the best time.
Did you ever encounter the Soviets or on any of the missions or at times at sea?
Yes, I believe that most of the times that I encountered, I was on the Arnold, the sister ship to the Vandy. In fact, I had a picture of taking one of the helicopters from the Soviet ship, came over with a big red star on the side, and they took pictures of us, and we took pictures of them. And in fact, I don't remember which ship it was. At Christmas time one year, we even exchanged gifts with the Russians. They sent a boat over and gifts for us, and I tossed in a pocket knife, I think. But we always kept them just about eight miles away from us. They were usually right on the horizon, and we tailed them because we knew where they were going. They were doing the same thing that we were doing.
So were they tracking? I mean, when the Russians would launch, both the countries would track each other's missiles. Is that right?
Well, they were out there to track their missiles. They had telemetry tracking. Of course, we had a little bit more sophisticated tracking, and we always tailgated them, tracking their missiles. And so we played tiddlywinks all the time. Let's see, one of the guys back in the weather station, in the hangar area, we had a Kytoon back there. But Kytoon is a big balloon where we'd tie to the data, and an airplane would come along and pick it up, and we call it a data snatch. Pick up the data and take it up to the airplane, and then bring it back to Patrick to be reduced. And we had this Kytoon in the hangar deck, and the weatherman helicopter went back behind him, and the elevator door was up. So he lets the door down, and the helicopter goes down trying to see what's in the hangar. And they got down just about above the water, and they figured, well, there's not going to be anything. They go back up, and he'd raise the door back up. But we had a lot of fun with it.
What would you say? I mean, obviously, next year the Vandenberg may be at the bottom of the ocean floor out in Key West. And what do you think about that?
I think it's a good place for it. I mean, people, of course, without it having all the antennas on it and everything, you won't be able to tell that it's too much of the Vandenberg. But there's a lot of nooks and crannies that the fishes can find. My office was up on 01 level, which is one deck above the main deck, and so it's all wide open area. It's the part that was built up just under the antennas, but there's nooks and crannies that the fishes can play in.
What was it like being at sea that long? I mean, they had some. You guys had some extended missions there where they had. You know,
yeah, there's one extended mission was the first extended mission that the Arnold made. I think it wound up to be about 99 days. I had some pictures taken of the guys during the time shooting marbles, making up signs, who won the election. Geez, I don't know what all kinds of signs we made. We hung up when the supply ship was going to come alongside.
So did your mail find you, or was mail kind of...
Yeah, this was about 800 miles northwest of Midway. And all the Christmas mail and everything else showed up at once. It was a few days after January, I guess, beginning of January. And they had about 60, 70 bags of mail for us. And that was a lot of fun going through those and sorting it out. But yeah, we extended quite a bit of extension, especially up at the broad ocean area there above Midway. And up off of Alaska, we'd go into Adak to get fuel and everything before we'd go down off of Kamchatka and to do some of the tracking of the reentry of the Russian missiles into Kamchatka. And
did you get a feel? I mean, being there and seeing that ship, did you get a feel for how we stacked up with the Russians? Do you think, when you'd see our vehicles come in, you'd see their vehicles, did you see any difference in there?
Oh yeah, there's quite a bit of difference. We knew what their missiles was. In fact, the first glance at the radar, we could tell what missile it was, by the configuration of the reentry vehicles. And we had the sophisticated radar, which they didn't have. They had most of their tracking was telemetry type tracking. Of course, we had the telemetry and the radar. But as far as stacking up was concerned, all of our missiles that they tracked was out in the Kwajalein area, most of them. But I think it was the Vandy that, I believe it was the Vandy that actually got a piece of one of the reentry vehicles that fell on the deck. That was down off of south of the equator on one trip. I don't remember which trip it was, but I wasn't on that one.
How big was that? I mean, when the re-entry vehicles are kind of the cone-looking things, right?
Right, but when they hit the ocean, they break, and of course it splatters up, and there was a piece of it that fell on the deck.
Because if it was a direct hit, it obviously would have probably done some damage to the ship.
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, the ship was, down maybe about 1.5, 2 miles below where the splashdown.
Well, tell me about how you first encountered the ship. How were you introduced to the Vandy?
Well, before I actually get on the Vandy, I'd like to give you a little background of where I come from and what I did and
Sure.
how my final meeting came with the USNS Vandenberg.
No problem.
I was born in Canada, in the province of Saskatchewan, and I worked, after graduating from college, I worked for General Instrument Corporation for 8 years, and in 1961 I came to the range over here. But I was with Pan American at the time, and I worked 4.5 years for Pan American and joined the RCA community in the mid-1966. Shortly after I was in the engineering department, and at that same time there was a layoff in the engineering section, so the only alternative was to go to the ships. There was openings on the ship. Consequently, I was assigned to the USNS H.H. Arnold in about July 1966. And that was my exposure to the RCA and the ships, and I was assigned to work with Patrick Utek, which you have met. Patrick was our chief engineer at Patrick Air Force Base, and immediately it came time to go on a long trip to support the lunar orbiter shot, which was in 1966, which was to be supported from the Indian Ocean. And so we went to Pretoria, South Africa, and then on to Cape Town, South Africa, and joined the ship. Supported test 1721, which was the lunar orbiter, and after that proceeded through the Indian Ocean past Diego Garcia and on towards Australia and at Fremantle, and then after 2.5 days and 1 full day we headed for Pearl Harbor. I could interject a little story that happened on the strip.
Sure.
There's a crewman went on watch. Now you got to understand, there was an RCA contingency and a government contingency, civil service. So it was not RCA type, but it was the crew type, MSDS, I think they called them at the time. The crewman was on the watch on the aft of the ship, stern. He decided he wanted to commit suicide, so he took off all his clothes, and the only thing that he had on his hands, we understood, was a watch and a ring. So after he jumped in the water, when they finally recovered him, 8 hours later, 9 hours actually, he said that he had got rid of his ring and his watch because he had decided when he hit the water that he wasn't going to commit suicide, and therefore knew that the sharks were attracted to shiny objects, and he got rid of that. And as it turned out, the ship sailed for almost 4 hours towards Honolulu. The next watch came on duty, and the watch that was to be relieved was not there. Consequently, his clothes were at the base of the rail there. So the captain turned the ship around, and they sailed back almost 4 hours. And like a stroke of luck, they spotted him. This is now almost 8 hours after he jumped. And but in order to be able to retrieve somebody at sea, you got to maneuver the boat in a Williamson turn and bring the object that you're going to retrieve, or the person you're going to retrieve, on the lee side of the boat. And to do one of these turns is a 1/2 mile to 3/4 of a mile till you do around. And while they were doing this, they lost him. And but when they first spotted him, the RCA people in the navigation section had pressed the button on the navigator, and it gave them an exact latitude and longitude position. embarrassing to the captain now that they couldn't find them. They had to resort to the RCA navigation contingency to direct the captain on how to steer the boat, and they did, and they found him again, and they recovered the guy. And well, as we approached closer to Pearl Harbor, which was a few days, there was another boat came out and took him off there in a straitjacket. And this last we heard of him, and then we pulled into Pearl Harbor, and that was in 1966, after July 9th. That trip took a good month. Actually, for the people that actually sailed from Port Canaveral, it took more than a month to do that trip.
That's a long time. What, by looking at your collection of photos and your strong recollection of the dates and the facts, it sounds like this ship means a lot to you. What are your thoughts about this ship?
Well, as a small town farm boy coming from Canada, I was in awe and almost flabbergasted to what I saw and what I learned. It was like going back to school, only with hands-on training. And here you had an opportunity to apply everything you knew, learn everything you can from people who knew and people who didn't know. And so, with one exception, it was one of the more marvelous experiences that I've had, and that is the fact that I was married and had 3 children, and married people who have a wife, etc., etc. 6 months away to 8 months away from home is not the best environment. It's a way of breaking up your family quite easily. As a matter of fact, a lot of the people that were on those ships were either broken up, or they thought that by escaping from home for a while, that the situation would clear up when they came back. But that was not the case. The wife was gone. As a matter of fact, I know one case where, the guy was here, Al Middleshort. He came home and found only a table in the middle of the house, and all the furniture was gone. His wife was gone. So yes, it was a real experience. It had excitement. It had moments of depression, anxiety. When we were out in the Bering Sea, we were buzzed every day by the Soviet Badgers. This is the big aircraft that would fly over quite close to our bow, maybe 1,000 feet above the ship. We were visited by their helicopters. They flew around and took pictures of the Arnold and the Vandenberg, which I was on. And they were always trying to take more pictures of new equipment. Or every time we went out, they wanted to see what was new. And one of the laughing jokes was that we launched weather balloons out of the from the aft of the ship, out of the weather deck, out of the weather hangar, and it had a door that you pressed a button and rolled up and down. And as the helicopter would come around the back, the weather people would press the button and close the door. We had nothing in there, but they wanted to take a picture of the inside, and I don't think they ever got a picture of the inside of that weather dome or weather hangar. Other things that occurred when the helicopters buzzed us was the guys would have centerfolds of the Playboy magazines, and they would flash them over to the Soviet pilots in the helicopter, and they all had some kind of jokes or quips or comments to make. I don't think the Russians understood what we were saying, but they were interested in the centerfolds. And that is particularly some of the harassment that we really had. We had ships in the area. Sometimes at night, Soviet ships would go past us. Many times I thought, well, they're coming to attack us, but they never ever, they kept their distance and we kept ours. In the early part of the game, off Kamchatka, there became a almost a exchange program between the Soviet ships and the American ships, or the American ship, and that meant the Soviets would put the bow, and this actually happened on the Vandenberg, the bow of the ship right up against the fan tail or the side of the stern of the ship, our ship, and the guys would pass cigarettes and whatever, and illegal, but vodka and other things came on board the Vandenberg. Well, after the intelligence group got word that this was going on, and I think there was some type of an incident. There was some type of an incident where it almost created an international incident. The powers to be passed a decree that our ship would never be within closer to within a half a mile of the Soviet ships. The Soviets also did a harassment program. One of their ships, or at least, had a swimming pool on the fantail. And you know, when you're at sea for 45, 60 days, 70 days, they would display all their Russian women in bathing suits on the fantail. They'd come out pretty well in front of us and swing that ship around to give the guys, hang your tongues out, fellas, a full display of the Soviet women on board. And that's a real teaser, I can tell you that. There was an incident, and I think this was on the USNS Arnold, where we were somewhat closer than we should be to the Kamchatka Peninsula. There was a crewman. Well, first of all, I'll tell you about the thermal survival suits. We had someplace in Newfoundland, Canada, they made these big thermal suits, and they were big, bulky, and also well padded. And if you, for some reason, fell, was thrown over, or fell overboard, and if you didn't have a suit, your life expectancy may be about 5 minutes. I'm not sure. In the 35-degree weather or so, hypothermia would set in very shortly, and you'd be a goner. Well, this guy saw land, and he thought that he was going to swim over to the shore. Now, he made one mistake. He put his normal yellow life jacket on above his neck and on his shoulders here, and then tried to put his thermo red, orangey red suit over, but he couldn't button it properly here at his neck, and he jumped overboard. And till they were able to pick him up, he was a goner. You know, it takes time to lower the boat, get the guy, find him. You know, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, he's gone by then.
What do you think it'll be like when you see, you know, what do you think about the project that we're undertaking? The Vandenberg started out and it's had a pretty good history, but next year on May 5th, when it has its final port of call in Key West, what's your thoughts there of what we're doing to it?
Well, I think it's a wonderful idea. First of all, it'll do something for whether I know you call it the coral reef or building a reef, and the ship is not worth doing anything with for any other useful project. So therefore, I would have no objections or qualms of recommending and supporting what is planned for and what will eventually be done. I don't know. I don't think you should build a monument like they have at Pearl Harbor. Well, although it's not as important because at Pearl Harbor with the Arizona there was loss of life, but this was a very important project. It was the king of the projects in its day, and it was very instrumental in collecting data towards finally bringing down the wall and the Iron Curtain. When was it? 1990, 91, mm-hmm. whenever that occurred. And so any important aspect of the because it was such an important aspect of this Cold War business, the Vandenberg deserves its due, and I could think of nothing better than to put it in its final resting place at sea and build a coral reef.
Wonderful. Let's see. The Navy called the Vandy the Great White Ghost.
Ghost or whale? Ghost, okay.
Yeah, ghost, and about the protection. Talk about how the Vandy was, with all the technology on there, was 100%, data and research, and really couldn't defend itself. So, did you ever talk about the relationship with the Navy and when you were happy to see them? And
well, for a long time in the earlier part of the game, we were accompanied by a destroyer escort, and it was all. I never knew how much protection we would really get if the Soviets brought a submarine and fired a torpedo at us, or whether they shot a missile from one of their planes at us. But it was always comforting to have additional Navy support. We also knew that within a short time, if an incident did happen, we would be able to get Navy support from ADAC or some type of support from Japan airwise. But there was never any real assurance. As we know on the Pueblo, everyone thought that the Koreans would never take the Pueblo, and they did. And I think that we stood the same chance. Fortunately, an incident like that did not happen. My closest incident that I could think that just about happened was one of the Soviet shots overshot the Kamchatka impact area, and I think it overshot our ship by approximately a half a mile. And half a mile is when you're 30 miles offshore, and the missiles come within, go right over, almost over the top of your ship, and impact a half a mile beyond. That's a scary situation. And there was a guy named Bobby Nelson, and Bobby was the radar console, C-band radar console operator, and he's the guy that's watching the range closing in on the incoming missiles, or the missile that they were tracking. And he says, it's closing, it's closing, it's closing, it's going to hit us. And he dived under his console. Well, dive under your console or not, if we'd have been hit, the whole ship would have been a goner. And so but this, of course, was, you could hear him on the net, and everybody's knowing that this thing is closing in, and we didn't really know what was going to happen. So this was a scary moment.
My final question: you had some great pictures of some of the Arctic missions when the Vandenberg looked more like a refrigerator, inside of a refrigerator. Talk about some of those, the missions up in the Bering Strait where it's really cold.
In the Bering Sea.
Oh, Bering Sea.
The Bering Sea. Well, it's we were provided with thermal gear, not the real heavy survival suits, but we had thermal gear. In one of the pictures that you have of me, you'll see me dressed in temperature around somewhere between 35 or 40 degrees, and it was not the most pleasant of situations to have to get up, support. As a matter of fact, everybody had a little beeper right beside your ear, and this thing would go beep, 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 beep. And you had about 8 minutes from the time they would bring the radar, the crew got ready, bring the radars, the telemetries, the optics, everything up and ready for support. And that's really hustling to, and if you were out on deck, some of the instrumentation was out on deck, other people had to climb up there and maybe release something or align the optical equipment, point in the right way and all this kind of stuff. That was pretty cold. And
then that would mean like a launch or something was coming in?
well, yes, the intelligence group, I know how, well, we sort of know how they did it by satellite. And we'd always have X number of people on board who manned part of our communications center. And someone someplace in Turkey or in the Scandinavian countries were monitoring when these launches were going to occur. And one of the sad part about it is when you hustled within the 8 minutes, just as you got ready, they say false alarm, go back to sleep. Well, like our missiles, we would go into a hold, and somebody would repair the problem in 10 or 15 minutes, and they'd pick up the count. So no sooner you got into bed and under the covers, here goes the beep, 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 beep. And this always happens, strangely enough, most of the time, between 12 and 5 o'clock, and 12 midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning. So you were exhausted, because the next day you had to be at work anyway. And well, you try to rest as much as possible, but it was certainly took the toll on you. If I may, the people get awful grumpy on board the ship. They'd sooner, after 45 days at sea, they'd sooner hit you, punch you out, or something if you just happened to say just something that was not quite so. They would harass the stewards that would serve the meals. The steward would come there with a, and the seas was very unstable. The ship's unstable in rougher seas, and the guy would bring the soup, and this other guy would pick up the bowl, and he'd look at the steward and say, "I want soup without." The steward looks at him and says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Without your thumb in it." Up went the thing, and splash went the soup right on the table, and that was not very pleasant. And you didn't hang if you had an enemy or two on the ship, you don't hang around the rail, because you may disappear. So people get just like the survivor in the survivor group in there. They get choosy and grumpy and whatever, mighty quick.
What? I understand there were some women on board. What was it like for the women that served?
Well, the women were not ours. I mean, not ours. When I say ours, we were RCA, and the women that came with the intelligence group. And well, that's a story of its own, because they would usually board at Pearl Harbor, and you could always tell within a day or so what was going on. And those younger bucks that came downstairs in the morning with a smile on their face for breakfast had already paired up, and the older guys, well, you just you know the situation.
That's great.
So that's part of that. We had an incident in Portland, where one of the RCA crewmen shot up the ship. His name was Ron French, and he was out drinking and came in the evening, and where the ship was parked was by some overpasses, freeways, listen to me, anchored. Where the ship was anchored, this guy was making his way back under the overpass, and he met up with some winos under there, and somehow they snuck his booze away, or got his booze away from him. So he was mad, and he came on board the ship. How he had a gun on the ship, who knows? But he did get on board the ship, and when he snapped, from the time he got into his stateroom to the time he got into the passageway, and he went across the passageway to his next door neighbor, opened the door, John Carr. John was sleeping in there. This is around, I don't know, 8 o'clock at night, something like that, in the evening. Was sleeping like this, and Ron popped him, shot him, and the bullet glanced off his arm bone over here and missed his heart by just inches, and it lodged into the back of his, the bullet was still in his back when he left. years, well, not no years, but a long time after. And then he took off from there. I had just come in from downtown Honolulu, Waikiki, and I was in my stateroom resting. And the announcement came on that there was a shooting. And this is a different one than what Mac's talking about.
Not the captain.
I naturally got up wondering what was happening. Our instrumentation manager got up out of his stateroom, but in the meantime, this guy had entered the recreation room. And there were 3 people in the recreation room. Glenn Ashley, Hatcher, and well, I don't remember the third guy's name, but anyway, the one guy was writing a letter to his wife or girlfriend. It was close by the door at the far end, and this guy took a pot shot at him, and it hit the lamp right beside him. And he got up and out through the door. He then took a shot at Hatcher, who was tuning the TV, and it missed his head and blasted the screen, the television screen. And by this time, Glenn Ashley, who is sleeping, waiting for the movie to come on, sometime a little later, he raises his head and he looks around, and the guy shoots him, and it picks up the side of his head here, and the bullet grazes and puts a clip or a cut on the side outside his skull. And strangely enough, nobody died. The instrumentation manager wrestled the guy. He used to be a former wrestler, and he got him by the arm up with one knee on the head, and he pounced him into the ground, knocked him out. The instrumentation manager almost got reprimanded for injuring the guy. So that's basically an incident that was scary. Of course, I was with the one with Mac on board the Arnold. It was when the captain got shot. And well, you know the story there. It was like the 4th of July. Lights and the C-130 flying around, and the boat was in the water, and a lot of excitement. When we arrived within, I don't know, 5 miles of, I believe it was Yokohama, I'm not sure the exact part, we were met by another boat, and they took them off. So that's basically some of the highlights. Of course, while I was on the Vandenberg, I became manager of navigation and data handling. And then when I did get off the ship, I was a relief manager. And when an instrumentation manager from the ship would go on leave, I would be sent out for 6 weeks or whatever for the duration that he was on vacation. And then after I got off the ship in 1970, so close to 71, I was in the office at Patrick Air Force Base where Pat Utek was, and here I supported the crew, whatever the needs of the people who were getting off the ship, and then later got transferred to Sam Dowdy's group, where I wrote test plans for the ships to how to support some of these tests. Not always up north off Kamchatka, but it could have been off Kwajalein, the Marshall Islands, or off Vandenberg Air Force Base, or wherever, Guam, in Mindanao. Then later on, in '88, I was transferred to the data analysis group, where we strictly did signature data. And here, all this data that Mac Moreau was talking about was brought in, and we ran it off, made all kinds of charts, and then any test that you got, you'd have to make a presentation on it. And at these presentations were all kinds of intelligence groups, and they would ask many questions. And as a matter of fact, one of the tests where Khrushchev was denying something that the Soviets had, some of our people had to go from Patrick to Washington with the data in hand, because we were just reducing it, and tell the Russians or the Soviets that here's positive proof, and what you're telling us is not correct. And my completion with the ship's program was up till SS. I started with SS9s and completed SS21s.
Say your name and tell me what your job was on the Vandy.
Okay, my name is Henry Myers, and I was on the initial crew on the Vandenberg, and I was on the navigation system, navigation department.
So you guys were tracking the incoming.
No, we were locating the position of the ship.
Okay, so you were in charge of putting the ship in the right spot.
We had to know where the ship was to give accurate information to the telemetry and the radar.
Great. I saw Sam was showing me the pictures of some of the transponders, so that
right,
and so that was able to be localized and exact.
But see, we were the key crew. We were the very first ones. Nobody had ever done this before. We had to figure how to do it and drop the sonar buoys over, and then make the patterns around them using sonar to locate our position in reference to locate the beacon's position. And once they were located, then all we had to do is run the ship over that area using sonar to tell how far away we were from them. We could locate our position accurate enough to update our navigation system.
Tell me about, the technology when through the space program and through the missile program was it was all leading edge stuff, and a lot of stuff was being implemented, and just how rapidly changing. What was it like to have your hands on some of that new technology and also have it mobile on a ship?
Well, the thing to me was that it was the most interesting job I ever had, working at the Cape on the space program. And unfortunately I got laid off, or I'd still be there. But it was extremely interesting, and like you said, cutting edge. It was all new. Nowadays, when you look back on it, it is so old-fashioned that you'd say, why would people do that? Because there's satellites and everything which can do everything that we were trying to do. They can do it with a satellite. But it was really good. It was exciting, and I loved it. I think everybody did.
What does that ship mean to you when you see the pictures and you meet everybody? What kind of thoughts and feelings do you get when you see the Vandy?
Oh God, I loved it. I had never been on a ship in my life, and I was afraid I was going to get seasick as can be and everything. I never once got seasick, and we got in some pretty rough water, and I loved it. Just seeing it the first time was enough to really turn you on, because it was so different from anything, with all those big antennas. It was really, really impressive. The first time we saw it was in Brooklyn. It was still being outfitted. Then they went from there to Hoboken. They, I think, loaded supplies or did something. Then we went to Bayonne. Everything was loaded and everybody was on, and then we sailed from Bayonne to Baltimore. And there at the key highway yards there in Baltimore, I don't know, it was the Blue Angels or whatever, they flew over during the ceremonies for the plane. Unfortunately, I just threw the paper away that had that not too long ago.
No kidding. One of the things we found in our research was that when you guys on the initial crew were sent out, nobody really knew how this stuff was going to work, and part of your job was to figure it out, make it work, and to pretty much figure it out. With there wasn't a lot of test time because they wanted to get it going. And is that true?
Totally true. We had no idea, because we knew telemetry and we knew radar, but we didn't know navigation. And navigation, without that, the ship wouldn't have been any good at all. So we were using an inertial navigation system, which was very new because the Navy used them on submarines only. Of course, we got the oldest one, but it didn't matter. It worked good for us. And we had a star tracker, which was amazing because you could actually see stars during the day in a clear sky and locate your position to update your navigation. The sonar buoys were just in case you couldn't have a clear sky, or if it was night, you could locate your position with the sonar buoys if you couldn't see the stars. But we had sonar, we had LORAC, we had inertial navigation, and then the star tracker. They all worked together.
Some of the folks, when I talk to some of the guys here, they say that some where it was just a job. I mean, it was a very exciting job, and didn't really know the Cold War, they were so focused on what they're doing, they really didn't think of themselves as fighting a Cold War. It was just the technology and making it work and doing a good job. Where was your part in that?
Never thought of the Cold War at all. Never entered my mind. It was just a very interesting, exciting job. And some of the things they did were really exciting too. We tracked a missile one time. I guess we were down in the Bahamas someplace. And it was a test for us because we had never done it before. And the thing that was neat, in order to get the data back to Patrick for them to analyze it, they had the data in a box and they put a big balloon up. And a C-130, where the thing came down and caught that bag and took it off. But when you're standing on a deck and you see that C-130 flying towards you, you think it's going to run right into the ship. But it's a lot higher than you think it is. When it gets close, you see it's higher. But that was really interesting, seeing that.
Now, so if you were in Michigan, you worked during the Gemini program.
Yes.
Right on land. Did you graduate when the Apollos too?
I was there at Mission Control Center during Gemini and the early Apollo up until right after the fire. We were working on that shot. And then after the fire, things got really bad at the Cape. I had to transfer to range safety, and then I was there for a year or so and then got laid off.
What was it? But when you were laid off, were you still assigned? Was it with the Vandy, or was that when?
No. After I left the ships, I was totally at the Cape then.
Oh, okay.
No ships anymore after that.
I see. Well, I guess what I'm going after is with your experience with the space program from the land. What was it like to track those things, or to be involved in tracking some of the spacecraft from the water? Did you get a chance to, or no?
It was, to me, on the ship, it wasn't exciting at all, because the navigation, if you knew where the ship was, it was like not even being there, but being at range mission control. That's the ultimate high right there. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
Really, really fun. Of course, I almost blew it there one day. We had our master timing system right near our equipment, and nobody was supposed to come in there except for us that worked in there. So one day I see these three guys standing over there setting their watches, and I'm just about ready to tell them to leave when I realize that it's a couple of the astronauts setting their accutrons by our system. So fortunately I didn't say anything.
That's funny. That's very funny. Well, let's talk about the ship. So when we have how we've become involved in ARC is we plan to turn the ship into an artificial reef. What do you think about that? Next year on May 5th, we hope to preserve it and put it on the bottom. What's your thoughts on that as someone who's served on the ship?
Well, I often wondered what happened to the ship, because after I left the ship, I didn't have, I didn't really keep track of it. But I'd drive by Port Canaveral once in a while, I would see it, then all of a sudden I never saw it anymore, and I often wondered what happened. And the ship is very old. It's like at least 60 years old. It was built for World War II. It's probably about worn out, so I'd say that this is as good a thing as they can do with it. And I'm glad that I know what's happening to it, since I had, so much to do with it from the beginning here at RCA anyway.
I'm going to run through my list here to see. With navigation, were you guys ever responsible for destroying classified material? Did you ever get involved, and if you had to, you guys scuttle the ship or anything like that?
We had no plan that I knew of for anything like that. Knowing the ship's position wouldn't have been classified. The equipment itself would have been classified, but if the ship sunk, it would be ruined anyway.
Gotcha. What was like one of the longest tours you had to do out there?
Well, I was primarily on the ship for the first year and a half, 2 years on both ships, and we were basically still learning how to use everything for the people to come. And I guess the longest we were out was maybe a month. And we didn't go anyplace, just down as far as Antigua, I think, and then back. We never went in any port other than Port Canaveral and Baltimore.
With the contributions that Vandenberg has made to our program, do you feel some pride in that you guys kind of broke new ground with that ship and fixed it up for everybody?
Oh, absolutely. Believe me, I wish I could have worked my whole life on the space program, but I couldn't. I feel that a lot was accomplished, yes. And I am proud of it, very, or I wouldn't be here today.
Very good. All right, Sam. Well, tell me about your experience and what the Vandenberg means to you.
Well, let me back up a little bit. Before the Vandenberg, I was on the American Mariner. That was my first taste of ship's operations. And the Mariner was a Liberty-class ship with a pair of F-16 radars on it. The F-16 was a high-precision tracking radar, C-band, made by Moorestown. I worked that for about a year, mostly down around Ascension Island, but then we also got down to St. Helena one time, and so I got to visit Napoleon's abode there when he was in exile, and the tomb where he was buried for 11 years before the British allowed the French to retrieve the body. Mm-hmm. And after that, I went back to land-based radar engineering for a while. But in 1964, when the ARIS began to get into operational use, they wanted my ship experience on the ARIS program. So I worked with the ARIS and the Vandenberg then for almost 20 years, mostly doing mission planning for the ships. And of course, some of the other guys have already told you about operations in the Bering Sea, where we sat about 35 miles off the coast of Kamchatka and watched the missiles impact on the land up there.
Well, tell me what that was like. Actually, I haven't heard about the impact zone. And mostly heard about the conditions, but not really the nuts and bolts.
Well, yeah. The Russians used Kamchatka as their primary test target. They would launch from Tyuratam, from Vltsetsk, and from operational bases, and even from submarines in the Sea of Japan, and impact in a land area on the coast of Kamchatka. We would take up station about 30 to 35 miles off there. We wanted to go into 12 miles, but the State Department says 35. So we usually tried to stay at least 35. Sometimes we sort of edged in a little bit. Generally, we made the 35-mile limit. And when the Russians would launch, we would get a warning. As Sam Nenson mentioned, you usually had about 8 to 10 minutes to get up and get all the instrumentation up, even in the middle of the night, and be ready to start tracking as it come over the horizon. And we started that monitoring up there and off the Kamchatka Peninsula in 1965, and it continued for 18 years. So we weren't there all the time, but we'd go up, and originally, as Sam Nenson mentioned, you'd be up there for 45 to 60 days at a time. But after 30 days at sea, say hello to somebody in the morning, you might get a fist in the chops. Just everybody got very tense after that long together. Of course, we were completely out of contact with anybody. No mail, no phones, no nothing. No contact with home other than if somebody died, well, you might get a classified teletype message saying that your wife died. But so what? You still couldn't get off the ship and go anyplace until the ship completed its mission. Well, later on, the powers that be sort of took a different view, or took a kinder view of the crew, and said, okay, we're going to make it a 6-week schedule, but 3 weeks on station, go back into ADAC to refuel for give the crews a couple of days off, get their mail, be able to phone home, and then go back out for another 3 weeks. And that was the normal mission duration. 3 on, a couple of days in ADAC, another 3 weeks on, and then you went back in. And of course, each time you went in, you had to package up all the tapes and everything like that and send them off to Patrick for processing. And of course, we also covered the what we called the BOA tests, the Broad Ocean Area tests, where the Russians would launch to the northern Pacific areas for testing to longer ranges, and they could get just fine to Kamchatka. And the Russians had a fleet of missile tracking ships we called SMRIS, Soviet Missile Range Instrumentation Ships. And depending on the number of ships that they sent out, you could pretty well gauge how important the shot was. If they just sent out 2 ships, it was one of their older systems, but they just wanted to recheck to make sure it would still go at full distance. If they sent out 4 ships, you knew that something important was up. And so they had up to 6, but they very seldom sent out more than 4. One time they sent out 5. And that was on the last mission that the Arnold ever covered. But in jockeying for position on those BOAs, you looked at the positions of the SMRIS and then tried to calculate where the RV was going to hit, or RVs in case of multiples. And you went tried to get about 5 miles downrange and looking straight up the track for a good coverage. Occasionally there was a slight misjudgment there because you weren't sure exactly how long the flight was going to take. By flying to higher apogees, why it took longer, flying lower, it got there faster. So you just sort of had to guess in between and try to get there so you're looking straight up the pipe at the right time. Now, once in a while, they would miss and get too far downrange or go past the point and then have to turn around and come back. Hoping that the missile wouldn't arrive while they're in the process of turning around. One time, they made a slight miscalculation, and it was a multiple RV launch, a multiple RV system. I can't remember what kind, but anyway, one of the RVs came zooming past the Vandenberg and appeared to be heading for impact just off the ship. Well, it turned out that it was a triggering test. The Russians had replaced the actual atomic or nuclear package with depleted uranium, which is inert and will not react. But they did have the explosive charge in there that forces the piece of uranium together to start the reaction. That apparently was fused for something like about 10 feet off the sea surface. Maybe about 50 feet off the sea surface, because they were watching this come in, and the IFLOT operator, the optical operator, said he could read the serial number as it went past, and then it blew up and blew pieces of RV all over the decks of the Vandenberg and put a hole through the C-band antenna. I think the patch is still there today. But
I saw the picture of the pieces that was recovered.
And of course that was considered very hush-hush. The intelligence people wanted this, or ordered the ship to get right into Pearl Harbor and send off, package up all that stuff, send it off to CIA or Air Force FTD or whoever immediately. And there was to be no mention of this in any of the dispatches or anything. So About 2 weeks later, Jack Anderson's Washington column, Washington Merry-Go-Round, he has the full details of that operation. So much for secrecy.
So that was when it was published in the paper, right? Is that
Yeah. Jack Anderson had it in his daily column.
And tell me about that paper, because what was this, like a newsletter? Was this the RCA newsletter? Or?
No. Jack Anderson is a nationwide political columnist, or was.
Okay.
And he was on the staff of the Washington Post. So his column was published in the Washington Post, but syndicated across the U.S., so it showed up in hundreds of newspapers.
That's funny. How long did that take? I mean, how do you get that information? It was leaked to him, you think, or?
Nobody knew, but he apparently had some contacts.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
If you have access to LexisNexis, well, you can probably go back and search somewhere around 72, 73.
I think we have the article. Someone brought the article.
Okay.
We were able to scan it in.
Okay, good.
You thirsty, by the way?
No, thanks. But anyway, there was that case, and then there was another case of high security. And in this case, it was another broad ocean area operation, this time up north of Midway Island. It was the first Russian BOA launch of a multiple RV system, an SS-9 Mod 3. And our optical platform, which was slave to the radars, got good pictures of all 3 RVs trailing wakes behind them as it came in. And that they were going to classify that top secret, except we didn't have the capability within our RCA operation there to keep top secret stuff. We just had secret, so they said, okay, we'll let it go as secret, but be very careful of it and stuff like that. Well, about 3 or 4 weeks after we first processed that film and had the meeting down there with all the users to show them what we'd collected on those tests, got a call from an official at the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington at the Pentagon, and he said, "Hey Sam, those films on showing the 3 RVs." I said, "Yeah." I was sort of scared because you weren't supposed to mention that over the normal telephone. And he says, "Well," he says, "I'm going to have an airplane down there in the next couple hours. Send them up to me." Well, I can't do that. We're just contractor to the Air Force. So that's Air Force property. So you call the Air Force ship's office and talk to them. So he did. And sure enough, they came over, signed out that film, put it on the T-33. That night it showed up on CBS News.
Wow. That's amazing. So that was the 3 warhead entries that we
Yeah.
So that was probably a big deal. That was maybe the first time.
Yeah. First Soviet mission to the broad ocean area with 3 RVs. So.
Now what did that picture look like? Because we've got some pictures of some streaks through the air. Was that?
There were 3 streaks coming down at about a 45-degree angle.
Wow. What's that like to be on the bad end of that, even though they're supposed to be dummy warheads?
Oh, it's very interesting to be able to stand out there and watch them come in. You can see the first hints of a contrail way up, and then very bright, almost flame-colored streaks coming in, and then they form a wake, sort of a contrail as they get lower down, and then they come in and plunge into the ocean, and you get a huge geyser of water that goes up probably 150 feet where they had.
Is the bright portion, is that actually the rear entry into?
Yeah. Well, the Air Force considered anything below 500,000 feet as re-entry into the atmosphere. So It's similar to the reentry of the shuttle.
Sure.
The shuttle, of course, has the protective insulating tiles, but as it comes in, it overheats or gets very, very hot, and is glowing. If you remember seeing infrared pictures of it.
I've seen the thermal, the infrared.
Yeah. The RVs do the same thing. Essentially, the RV is a wrapper around the warhead. It's there to protect the warhead during reentry and make sure the warhead survives down until where it's supposed to be triggered off.
Does the reentry part of it stay with it all the way till the fuse goes?
Yeah. That reentry cone usually stays with it all the way down. There was one older system that had a pointed cone that was on there, and which was intended to burn off during the hottest part of reentry, and then there was another rounded bulbous nose under that. The intent was that the pointed section took the first brunt of the reentry heat, and then they had a heavy insulation that took care of the rest of it.
Do they come down pointy end or fat end first?
Pointy end first for aerodynamic stability.
I see. Okay. And now, how does on the accuracy? That's nothing but good old-fashioned physics with angles and velocity.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You have to when you launch, you have to program the impact information into the missile. It goes up and it establishes the position and velocity vectors that when its engine burns out, it's going to be in the correct path. Of course, usually what happens is you have the main stage that gives it first boost, and then a second stage and a third stage. And then the third stage has little vernier thrusters on it that do the final adjustment until the computer says, okay, you're set, shut off now.
That's interesting. So what was it like? This technology was kind of being invented as you guys were going along. What was that like to have the world's most hottest computers, which I know today aren't the same, but to have it in your hands?
Well, it was quite a thrilling operation. As I said, it was enough to keep me interested in the job for almost 20 years there. So I started with Aris in 1964 and retired in '84. Of course, I'd been with the Mariner for a year before that.
So as the Vandenberg went from when you guys took it to sea at first, you guys had to kind of field test it, to when it was retired, it kind of went for a full circle there, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. We made hundreds of modifications to it, did all kinds of things to upgrade it to keep it. We had to upgrade to keep up with the change of technology in the missile field. As the missiles improved, the tracking had to improve.
What about the space program? What kind of experience did you have with Apollo and
we did some tracking of the Apollo, and we also did tracking of the lunar landers that preceded the Apollo mission when they were looking for a landing site.
I mean, around when they were testing on the Earth orbit, or around?
When they were lofting up to the moon.
Okay.
Unmanned. The Arnold one time had to go out and collect radar and telemetry data out in the Indian Ocean between Africa and Australia on a launch from Patrick, or from the Cape, that went around the world and then went off up toward the moon and eventually landed on the moon to see whether it would survive or not.
Right.
And so I got an around the world trip out of that. Flew out of Patrick to New Jersey, and then over to Frankfurt, down to Cape Town, and then sailed on the ship from Cape Town out to the test area, and then off to Fremantle, Australia, and then flew from there via Clark Field back to LA and home that way. So I did an around the world trip. And
You must be proud of the contribution that you and the Vandenberg kind of contributed to the missile program and some pretty big technology too.
Yeah. I think the Vandy system and the crew did a great job there. It took a whole program, not just a particular person. There was the engineering group that kept up with the tracking technology, and then there were the operations people like Sam Nenson, who were actually aboard the ship that did the thing. And I was the mission planner. I told them where to go, when to go, and what to do when they got there. And very often I would have to go out and sail on the ship to brief it with new information that we just received and was too hot to send through the mails.
That's exciting.
Uh-huh.
What about now? You've learned about what we're going to do. ARC plans to turn the Vandy into an artificial reef next year. What do you think about that? What are your feelings?
It's a much better end than the poor Arnold got. Of course, I blame the Arnold for this leg anyway, but that's all right. She was a good ship, and I hated to see her turned into razor blades or Toyotas or whatever she wound up as.
You think? Do you plan on going down with us next year? And
I'm going to try to. Yeah.
What do you think your thoughts will be as you see that thing break water and go under?
Well, just say there goes most of my career right down the drain.
Well, tell me a little bit about what your job was on the ship. What was your experience like with the Vandy?
Well, I started out being responsible for planning the tests on the Vandy, and in connection with that, after writing the plan, I sometimes had to go to the ship and oversee the way it was carried out.
These were the actual the missile tests?
These were actual missile tests. In other words, we were tracking missiles, and the ship had to have some instructions on how to do it. So we wrote a 20 or 30 page plan on what to do. Sam, who you just talked to, was one of our chief planners, and he wrote the test. And we go out there and track missiles.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, what was it? Something I keep hearing and I'm interested in is about how this technology was so new, and that the things you were writing, just like technology today, has to be updated, and some of it was sort of untested and was being tested on ships like the Vandy.
Well, the whole concept of missile tracking was fairly new. I mean, the first ship that had tracked missiles successfully was the American Mariner, which was the predecessor to this two Arrow ships. And I was part of that program too. It had been thought before the Mariner that tracking missiles from a ship with a ship radar was very close to impossible. And yet the Mariner went out and did it. The Mariner went out and tracked Thors and Jupiters, and proved that it was quite feasible to do so. So based on that kind of evidence, the government decided to build these two ships with advanced technology, improved radars and so forth. And they were built, and I guess they were built about 63 or 4, something like that. And they had advanced radar and telemetry. And the idea was that they were going to be used to track United States missiles that were being developed, mostly fired from Cape Canaveral, mostly fired downrange. Initially, the shorter range missiles were fired into Antigua Net, and the longer range missiles were eventually fired into Ascension, or even beyond Ascension. We had troubles initially getting the ships to work because some of the technology that they used, some of the radar techniques that they used initially just didn't turn out, and we had to do a lot of fiddling with the equipment to get it to track properly and work properly, and we had problems with the recording or problems with the operation. One of the odd things I remember is that when the ships were first delivered, the noise in the control room, in the console room, was incredible. You know, standing next to somebody in the console room, you could not communicate unless you were both wearing earphones and on the net. And the reason was that they were 400 cycle blowers to cool the equipment and all the equipment, and that the noise was unbearable that those blowers made. I mean, that was eventually changed. But eventually, we got the ships working and tracking things. And then about 1965 or so, a really interesting phase of things began because the Russians started shooting missiles into the Pacific off Kamchatka. And the government decided that they needed to get some information on those things, so they sent the ships one at a time out there. And we did pretty well tracking those missiles. And I remember one thing, and I think it was in '68, a curious coincidence. The Arnold in the Pacific off Kamchatka tracked the first Russian multi-RV vehicle with 3 RVs on it. The very same week that Vandenberg at Ascension tracked the first 3 RV MERV Minuteman. So it was curious how these things just came together within a week of each other. They happened.
I understand there was some classified. There was sort of a little bit of a tap dance on the 3 RV photo that was captured by the Vandenberg. Were you on the Arnold at that time, or which one were you on?
Actually, I was back at Patrick Air Force Base at that time. But
how important were these ships? If you were back if you did some work at Patrick, how important were these ships? The data that would come in. What was that like when you guys would kind of wait for some of that data to come in?
Well, you know, some of the data that came in was really quite important because it was data that had not been seen before. So you know, when you start a new area, the first information that comes off it is extremely interesting and extremely important. And I can't remember the year now. I guess it was in the early '70s. We had been tracking Russian missiles for several months, a couple of years, and we had collected a lot of data on them. And the Air Force thought it was important enough that they briefed it up to higher levels. And I remember going, as part of a briefing team, going to Washington and briefing all the service secretaries and briefing all the way up to the President's science advisor at that time. So it was really considered quite important. I think it contributed to the country's position with respect to the threat we faced, because it was a more realistic evaluation of what the threat really was than anybody could speculate about. So I think in that sense we made a real contribution to what has been called the Cold War. As time went on, you know, we tracked more American missiles and more Russian missiles and so forth. And we even tracked, I wasn't aboard at the time, but occasionally the Russians would fire a very long-range shot into the mid-Pacific, and they'd issue notice to mariners, as they're required to do by international law, defining what the impact area would be. And of course, the ship, the Vandenberg, sometimes the Arnold, but often the Vandenberg, would try to get as close to the impact as possible without actually being hit itself, which is an interesting maneuver. And I think that once they misjudged things a little bit, and you may have heard this story before from one of the other people, but some of the pieces of the incoming missile actually landed on the deck. So they were pretty close. And the actual pieces that were retrieved went into the appropriate agencies to analyze them and see exactly what was the technology the Russians were using to build their missiles. So from that point of view, I think we made a very significant contribution to this country's position in the Cold War.
What do I understand? I think that might have been the triple RV.
No, that wasn't the triple RV.
Oh, that was the standard one?
I really don't remember what missile it was, but I do remember that incident. and we had not only radars on the ship, but we also had optical equipment, and so they had optical signatures and radar signatures of these equipment. Then they had the pieces themselves, so they could do a pretty good analysis of what was going on with Russian technology.
So where did you spend most of your time? Was it on Patrick or on board, do you think?
Most of my time was in Patrick. I said I was responsible for planning for the first few years. Then for about 4 years, from about 68 to 72, I was the manager of the whole ship program, and so I spent most of my time at Patrick, worrying about keeping contact with the Air Force and keeping the pieces together and fighting for a budget and things like that. So,
what does the ship mean to you? I mean, from the beginning to now, what are your personal feelings towards the ship?
Well, I think it was a good tool, and I think it did its job. I think the job is it's over now. I mean, the Cold War is over, and look, we won. So I don't think that exact kind of a function is necessary at the moment. But that's okay. I mean, time passes and things change and the rules change. And besides, we have other ways of collecting information now. We have much more sophisticated satellites and things like that. And the threat, such as it is from the Russians, is considerably less than it was then.
Tell me what an exciting time that was to be in Brevard County and to be here during that time of of our country's history.
Well, Brevard County at that time was just sort of beginning to burgeon, you know. I mean, when we came here, it was, I don't know, the population was maybe a third of what it is now, if I recall right, and things were just starting up. I mean, they were just starting to build up housing and roads, and things were just going in, and you know, well, one index is that on television, the PBS station only came on the air about 1970, as I recall. That was in Orlando. So, you know, civilization was slowly starting to seep into the place. Now, of course, it's much better. Well,
what I'm looking at is, like, I mean, just the ground zero of American technology, and as far as missile and space, this was the hot spot. You know, what was it like seeing kind of, you know, the eyes of the world?
Well, it was kind of exhausting, you know, because you see these crazy things happening all the time. Like, I remember once the ship was supposed to be covering a Polaris launch at the Cape, and I went out to the Cape and the control room to watch it, and they counted it down, 9, 8, 7, 6, down to 0. Nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened. Everybody sat around for a few seconds looking at each other. Then they decided that the missile had hung up on the pad. So somebody had to go out and pull the cables off that missile before it blew up. Thank God that wasn't me, but I mean, I remember one trip on the Vandenberg, I don't know where they got him from, but they got a cook on board who made soup. He used to make 3 or 4 different kinds of soup for lunch. And I happen to be a little bit of a nut on soup anyway. I like all kinds of soup. This is some of the best soup I've ever eaten in my life. I don't know what happened to that man, but what he should have done is go open his own restaurant, because those soups are incredible.
You normally don't hear about good food on ships. You're the first one to say that.
Well, it depends on the ship sometimes. You know, I mean, an American Mariner, which I mentioned before, which was the predecessor to all this, we had some incredible food on that ship, but we had pretty good food on the Arrow ships, on the Vandenberg.
You know, maybe that's something to compare. You guys were working for RCA. You weren't in the military, so did you get some extra benefits, some extra leeway that the other guys in the service didn't have, like when you came to port and dealing with the MPs and that kind of stuff? Did you have some extra liberties?
Well, you know, we were civilians, so when we came into port, you know, we did whatever we wanted. I mean, we had, of course, documentation. We had passes to get on and off base, obviously, but we were not subject to military rules. So we did whatever we wanted. You know, mostly the military people on board did what they wanted too. I mean, you know, when they got off the ship off duty, they dressed in civilian clothes. And
What did you have any interesting encounters with the Soviets? Some of the guys have talked about some of the flybys.
They did have interesting encounters. I was not aboard the ship when any of them happened, so I really can't describe any of that to you. But some of the stories are interesting. I don't know if you've heard the story yet, but once early when the ship was off Kamchatka in one of the early missions, there was a Soviet destroyer there. And I don't know whether the Soviet skipper was nervous or something, or what orders he had or anything, but from the reports we got back here, he actually leveled his guns at the ship at one point for reasons that are unclear to me at this distance. But it all settled down after a while. The ship was, they always considered the possibility that the ship might be boarded, not knowing how things were going in the Cold War. So they had elaborate destruct plans on board ship, and the computer printouts were on water-soluble paper that they would throw overboard in case anything like that. Fortunately, nothing like that ever happened. We never had to do anything like that. But they had contingency plans in case.
This is a little bit off the subject, and I only have a couple more questions. But as I talk to some of these folks, when you saw our spy plane that went down and landed in China, and your background in some of the intelligent and sensitive information, what were your thoughts on the incident in China?
Well, as far as I can tell, first of all, it's obvious that those surveillance flights have been going on for years. I mean, they're a routine thing. It's obvious that the Chinese don't like them and would like us to stop them. I think we had a situation here where the Chinese pilots, either under orders or on their own, were trying to harass the surveillance plane to get it to go away. And those planes don't harass easily. And so the pilot just, he made a mistake flying. He came a little too close and tore his tail off, and that was the end of him, and he wrecked the plane also. And, that's the kind of an incident that is. I would not be entirely surprised if it happened again, because I don't think we're going to stop the surveillance flights, and I don't think they're going to stop harassing us.
Well, tell me, my last question, you've seen what our plans are for the Vandenberg now. What are your thoughts on the final port of call and where we want to put it, we want to set it down in Key West?
I think it's a marvelous idea. I can think of no more fitting thing to do to this ship than to put it in a place and put it in a situation where it can contribute to civilian life, if you will. Making it a reef where marine life can be helped, and attaching it to a museum where you can teach people about what's going on in the ocean, I think is a wonderful thing to do.
Any thoughts if you were to see it go down next year? Of course, everyone's invited to come down. What would be your thoughts when it went under, do you think?
I think I'd probably stand and salute.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bob. And what's your relationship to the Vandy?
Well, I was an engineer with RCA, working in data handling engineering back in the late 60s, early 70s. And I think it was about 1969, I went to work for the Aris Ships Project. And I don't even remember the first trip that I took. I think it might have been in Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington.
Tell me about, we were talking about the story about the incident off the coast, because I haven't heard that one yet, about where you guys had the ships and the bomber kind of buzzed you guys. Tell me, back up a little bit and tell me how that was set up.
Well, what had happened, it was in September and October of 1972, and the Vandenberg was headed out to do some surveillance of Russian mission, rocket launches off the coast of Kamchatka, and they needed some engineers to volunteer to go man the different posts, because either they had laid off some technicians or something had happened. I'm not sure just what. And so I volunteered, and I can't remember whether I went to Port Hueneme and caught the ship or whether it was in Adak, Alaska. But I know that we left in September and came back the end of October. We were gone 2 months. We were up there incommunicado. And it was, a fairly routine thing. What happened, the way they did it was the ship sailed what they called a racetrack course, a 20-mile oval, up and back, around 20 miles off the coast of Kamchatka. And Kamchatka, is a peninsula of Russia with a lot of volcanoes. You could see those from the ship. And as I say, things were fairly uneventful until one morning, woke up and people were out on the deck, and I went out to see what was going on. And we saw all these ships on the horizon. And they kept getting closer and closer. And then all of a sudden, a Russian bomber, one of their Bear bombers, flew over. It couldn't have been more than 500 feet, maybe something like that over. You could see the hammer and sickle on the underneath side of it, in the wing. It was a little scary, but nothing happened, And then the ships, it turned out, it was a shipping lane, and they just kept going. They didn't, but it was a bit of excitement.
I'll bet. What was your exact job? You said you were an engineer and you'd volunteered. How many tours did you do with the Vandy?
I don't even remember, because I was on both the Arnold and the Vandenberg. Well, what I would do is, as an engineer, we would get a job to design equipment, for the ship's instrumentation, make modifications or whatever. So what I would do is I would have these built in our shops at Patrick Air Force Base, and then I'd fly out with a technician, and we would install these in, just wherever the ship happened to be at the time. And I remember one time we had a job that we were remodeling some equipment that had some problems with the wiring. The insulation on the wiring had abraded, and it was causing shorts, and they were having a lot of problems. And so we took these chassis back to Patrick Air Force Base, back to the shop, and completely rewired them with better wire. And took them back out. I flew with my technician to Canton Island, which is in the Phoenix group. And we were out there a couple of days, and then I think it was the Vandenberg, although we did this on 2 ships, both the Vandy and the Arnold. We went out by small boat out in mid-ocean, and I remember handing these chassis up the ladder, the big heavy chassis. Guy, came down and grabbed him, and we boarded the ship by climbing up the ladder. It was, not too bad. The ship was a little bit.
What was it like as far as the technology? I know that you guys, especially as an engineer, your job was probably, the technology was leading edge at the time and constantly changing, and it was changing for national security reasons. So was there some pressure involved with keeping everything working and producing data?
Yeah, there really was. Most of the work that we did had to do with radar tracking and recording data, and then taking it back, taking the mag tapes back to Patrick for data reduction. In fact, there was a group there that I went into later, a group called Signature Processing, Radar Signature Processing. And the way that was kind of interesting the way that happened. I was on the ship up in Adak, Alaska, and I got a phone call.
Hi, Dave. Hey, go ahead, Roger.
We were up in Adak, Alaska, and there was a phone on the dock. Somebody came in and said I had a phone call. So I went out, and it was my boss back here at Patrick, and he said, I hate to tell you this, Jack, he said, but you've been laid off. Nothing like mincing words. I said, what? But he said, you've been offered another job. And he said, I'll give you a few days to think about it. I said, well, what's the other job? He said, working with so-and-so in signature processing. And I said, how about 30 seconds? I accepted it. And I came back and I went from the engineering job that I was doing to reducing data, you know, the different radar data that came in, you know, what they call.
What does the ship mean to you? When you think about the ship and you see it and you talk to people, what kind of feelings does that bring up?
Well, it's rather nostalgic because there are many of us that spent a lot of time on there. Of course, I wasn't on there full time like many of the people you've probably talked to, but you know, when you go out and if you're out a month, 2 months, and having been in the Navy on a ship, I don't know, it means a lot because, you know, that's part of your life. And I can remember times when we were in storms and I didn't think we were gonna, you know, it was pretty scary because the ship was really, really rolling. I mean, and when I say rolling, it's hard to imagine that a ship that big could roll that far without going over, you know, but it always came back, of course. But I think just the camaraderie with the crew and the people that I worked with, you know, and the good food, the great food, you know, that we had. And then at times when you're not busy, you know, you can go out on the deck and, you know, get sun or whatever.
What do you think about our plans to make it an artificial reef?
Well, I heard about that a month or two ago, and I think it sounds like a great idea, you know. What better way for the ship to serve, you know, as an artificial reef.